Another vaccine setback, the road ahead for business and men's-only clubs in the modern world. Welcome to Q&A. Hello and welcome to the program live from Melbourne tonight. It's great to have a small number of you at least in the room as we emerge from lockdown in this city. Joining me on the panel tonight, restaurateur and social change advocate Hana Assafiri, businesswoman, philanthropist and the force behind the AFLW, Susan Alberti, radio broadcaster Tom Elliott, Shadow Minister for Aged Care Services Clare O'Neil, and in Canberra, the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel, Darren Chester. Please make them all feel welcome. Well, hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Speers, the host of Insiders, filling in for Hamish tonight. It is terrific to be with you. Now, remember, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag, and we'd love you to get involved. We've got a lot to get through tonight, including today's big news regarding the changing advice on AstraZeneca. We will get to that shortly. Our first question, though, comes from Luke Challen.
G'day. My question is, last week, I think it was, the Australia Club voted against having women involved. I think 62% agreed not to. Do you think that's a generational issue, or do you believe it to be a helpful and assisting thing to a society to have men and women only clubs?
Susan Alberti, let's go to you first.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, look, I have a view on the men's clubs and women's clubs. I have a member of the family who is a member of the Australian Club, and I spend more time at that club on my own having dinners and functions than he has ever dreamt of. So if women want to have their women-only clubs and the men want to have theirs, I don't have a problem with it. So it doesn't bother me one little bit because I spend a lot of time at one of those clubs.
Tom Elliott, I understand you are a member of a gentlemen's only club, is that right?
I am. I had to think about it on the way over here. I'm a member of 8 clubs. One is men only, the other is all and any genders.
Do you mind sharing which club is the men's?
It's the Melbourne Club. The
Melbourne Club, okay. And why are you a member of that? Why is it important?
A friend's father asked me to join ages ago and I just said yes. I never even go there because I never have any time. But the thing is, and we need to think about these things, they are an anachronism, but that's not a bad thing. Like the Melbourne clubs, broadly, there's about 4 of them, plus the ones in Sydney, actually represent the old London clubs. That's what they were sort of built after. Weirdly, the London clubs aren't like that anymore. You know, they're just more like restaurants and things that you can go to these days.
The issue here is more whether women should be allowed to join. What do you think?
Well, they're social clubs. Like, people think that they're bastions of power and influence and all this sort of thing. I can tell you nothing could be further from the truth. They're just a social club. I mean, you might as well say, I went out to Druin a few months ago and spoke to a men's shed out there, older unemployed men in a country part of Victoria. Now, that's a men's club too. And no one's sticking up their hand and saying, oh, well, we should get rid of that. So they're social clubs. Look, I believe in, gender equality in business and in sport and all sorts of things, but social clubs are just that. They're social clubs. They don't have the power and the influence that people think they do.
Clare O'Neil, is men's shed the same thing?
I don't buy that. Sorry, Tom. I found this debate just totally amazing that we're still talking about this in 2021. And I actually have a lot of trouble understanding the mindset, Tom, and very interested to hear your reaction. Why would men not want to be in the same space as women? And I actually find this almost a little bit funny that there's this club and there's all these kind of what feel to me must be like sort of older men who, have a bunch of privilege that they didn't earn, probably don't deserve. And here they are in this final space in society where they still get to feel like kings of the world. And I just think it's time to wake up, guys. Like,
yes, but Clare, it may be argued, why do women feel the same way about their clubs? Yeah. Why are men not engaged with the women in their clubs as well? May be argued on the same way.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. And that's why I don't think, we should kind of outlaw these institutions or anything like that. But I do think it's a little bit funny that these guys only feel comfortable in a space where they're around other men. And the difference between the men's clubs and the women's clubs is, of course, that we exist in a society where men exercise massively more social and economic power than women. And the idea that we can compare this to a club of unemployed men is, frankly, I find that a little bit offensive. Sorry to say it, but
you asked me about men's clubs. I'm just saying there are many different sorts of men's clubs. And the other thing to remember is it's not like these men live at their club and do nothing else. You know, for most of them, they might go to lunch, I don't know, once a month or something like that. They have families, wives, daughters, as I do. And it's not something they go and do all the time. It's just one facet of their existence.
What's the problem from your point of view of letting women into the club that you're a member?
I actually don't have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with it at all. It's just never been put to a vote. I don't really care in the sense that...
Well, just on that, would you vote in favour of letting women into your club?
Yeah, I probably would. I mean, it hasn't come up because it's just... I spend so little time there, it's just not even an issue.
Hana?
But
Well, I think, I mean, whilst I agree with Claire, I do think that society is profoundly unequal and is built on a whole host of spaces being made available to men to be comfortable and to move around freely. And women have been tussling to endeavour to reform the system so that we can bridge the gender gap. So I find it astounding that in 2021 we have a group of the most privileged, and I think, with respect, Tom, I don't think that these aren't powerful lobby groups that sit behind the scenes in private clubs who impact how we shape society. I dare to say the most powerful club in Australia who has voted unanimously or unequivocally to deny women access to power and privilege is telling. And I guess for me, curiously, I'd be curious to know who the membership is of that club, which political parties, which institutions and corporations they belong to, and what their public position is on women and on sexism. Are they prepared to publicly state that they endorse the sexist and the denial of opportunity and inclusion for women? I would argue that their public standing there's a dissonance between what they say publicly and what they do privately. And
well, maybe, but two of the prominent members of the Australian Club in Sydney are former Prime Ministers.
Absolutely.
Malcolm Turnbull and John Howard. Well,
absolutely.
I mean, they're on the record as to what they believe about all sorts of things. And you can judge them on that.
Sure, but these are the places and spaces where decisions are made. We shape societies in these spaces.
Well, but on that, I would disagree. They're not the place where decisions are made.
But why are we concentrating on the men's clubs? Why not talk about the women's clubs as well?
Let me bring in Darren Chester here because you're sitting silent on this one so far. Minister, what do you think about these gentlemen's only and women's only clubs?
I was enjoying the argument, David. I'm probably not the best one to judge. I've set myself the task this year in Gippsland to visit every pub in my electorate, so not too many clubs in Gippsland which have this exclusivity to them. I do find it a little bit unusual and quite extraordinary, I guess, in the modern era that we would have clubs that would exclude people on the basis of gender and miss out on 50% of the population. When you think, look at the amazing women on your panel tonight, look at their bios. I mean, they've achieved great things in their lives already. Why wouldn't you want them as members of your club? But I do take Susan's point as well, that there's women's only clubs. I make the point though, Susan, one of the things we found here in regional areas that once we merged our football and netball clubs together, we actually got I think a better social atmosphere around our club with the netball's involved in the club, the mixing of the footballs and netballs, moderated behaviour a little bit, I reckon. And I think our footy and netball clubs have performed better as a cohesive part of community since we merged the two together. So, look, I'm not going to die in the ditch on this issue. It's just not something that particularly excites the people of Gippsland, but I've got to say it's unusual in the modern era that you'd cut out your chance to get half the population to join your club.
Well, on that, we might move on to our next question, which comes from Tasneem Youssef.
Good evening. My question is to the whole panel, but particularly to Mr. Darren Chester, who's the Minister for Veterans Affairs. According to today's announcement, the government has changed its stance on vaccines by increasing the age limit to 60 for people who can have the Pfizer vaccine. This comes after another recent fatality from a blood clot developed by a 52-year-old woman after taking AstraZeneca. Every life is a life. When other vaccines such as Pfizer and Moderna, which are safer options, are available, I fail to understand why the rest of the population, irrespective of age, cannot be given this. Would it take a queue of compensation claims for legal liabilities to make the government change its stance on dumping AstraZeneca, like many other countries have done that?
Tasneem, thank you, and I will get to the Minister in a moment on that, but let's just go around the panel here quickly. Hana, you've had one AstraZeneca jab. The medical advice is that you're still fine to go ahead and get the second, but how do you feel about it?
Look, I guess throughout this whole crisis, and I think for a lot of people, we were looking for direction, and I've been heavily guided by the medical advice. And the medical advice to date, whilst there's a lot of noise, still clearly indicates that the AstraZeneca is safe. I think our comms around it have enabled a lot of noise, which has resulted in hesitancy. So whilst, you know, I wish we invested in Pfizer, the better cousin of AstraZeneca, we didn't, and that's not available to us. And for me, vaccination is a roadmap and a pathway out of this. So we need to vaccinate, and we need to find messaging that enables others to feel reassured about about the reality of forging our pathway out of this. And at the same time, I am, I guess, heartened by the fact and reassured by the fact that we are being led by science on this, that scientists are not playing politics with an issue of vaccination. Should we have it? Shouldn't we have it? How do we forge a roadmap out? And they are making the difficult decisions of saying, to your point, that the AstraZeneca is, after all the research, not appropriate for people under 60. So I'm heartened by the fact that we're still following science. Our biggest problem is, post-science, there is no plan for how do we implement the advice of science.
Some doctors tonight reporting they're already receiving cancellations from people over the age of 50 and indeed over the age of 60 when it comes to AstraZeneca. But we need to stress the advice is still that it's okay if you've had that first jab to get the second, because Susan, I understand you're in the same position. You've had the first shot. How do you feel about this now?
Well, having been involved and funding and raising lots of money for medical research, I made lots of inquiries, and I'll admit up front that I was very hesitant about having the AstraZeneca because I felt there hadn't been enough trials and testing, and when you think we've brought it to fruition within 12 months, to me that was a very short period of time. But I made my own inquiries and I was advised to have it, not just for me but for the people around me, particularly my husband who's not well and my family. And I decided, when they said to me, my specialist said to me, I've been quite a sick person and I've got over all of that, and she said to me, just do it and stop talking about it. And that's what I did. I took the advice of medical scientists and the evidence that was at foot at the time, and I've done it and I don't regret doing it.
Clare O'Neil, the question from Tasneem basically suggests, you know, what point do we dump AstraZeneca altogether and just use Pfizer and Moderna? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think we follow the advice of doctors, and I'm certainly not going to develop a separate point of view about whether this is appropriate for over 60s, as the relevant body is saying it is. I think what's really regrettable here is we're kind of paying the price for the way that this vaccine rollout started, and it didn't start very well. We didn't get out of the blocks quickly enough to negotiate with enough people to provide us with different types of vaccines. So we sort of put all of our eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, and as it's turned out, that wasn't a very smart move. And really, you know, our vaccination program in this country is going terribly. We're 124th in the world now in terms of our vaccination rates of our population. Not yet 3% of our population has been fully vaccinated against COVID. So we needed this like a hole in the head. Now we've got, you know, most of our eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, and more than half the population can't even take AstraZeneca. So I think it's really frustrating for Australians, and especially for all of us in this audience who've just lived through yet another lockdown here in Victoria. We know our pathway out of this is a vaccination program that works. So I think, you know, there's a bunch of things that need to be done to get this program back on track. But if I could just mention one really obvious one, you know, we hear risk, risk, risk all the time with the vaccines, and this is another example where there's going to be a huge news story, front pages across the country, telling us that AstraZeneca is unsafe. What's missing is a publicly funded program that explains the importance of getting vaccinated. We don't have enough demand in Australia. The public is not pushing hard enough to get vaccinated. Now, we're so good at this as a country. This is actually, something we're known for globally. Our HIV campaign, our road safety campaign, our anti-smoking public health campaigns. We can actually do this, but the federal government just hasn't stepped up to the plate and said, we've got to find a way out of this. It's getting the population vaccinated, and so we're going to fix this problem.
Well, Darren Chester, let me go to you, just to the Minister on this, and coming back to the question, and the point that's been made a number of times here. The government only struck a deal with Moderna last month. Does today's news underline the problem with putting too many eggs in the AstraZeneca basket last year?
Well, David, the first point I'd make, and I think the most obvious point, is we should not be talking Australia down or talking Australians down with our performance so far in relation to this global pandemic. We've got ourselves into a position through a lot of people making very good decisions based on the science. So we've relied very heavily on medical advice. We've relied heavily on local, state and federal governments working together, largely in a very bipartisan way. And we've also relied on those frontline health workers who I say my enormous thanks to, the truck drivers who are out there delivering the vaccine around the country, and the Australian people who've made good decisions and followed the advice that's been given to them. Now, in terms of the vaccine rollout, we were in a position as a government where we didn't have to rush any process in terms of the TGA approval. So in terms of our normal vaccine approval process, we were able to do that to make sure the vaccines were safe. And we started negotiating with the various companies involved towards the middle of last year in terms of what vaccines may be available in Australia. There's going to be 4 vaccines available in Australia in the order of 195 million doses are on order. So I do reject some of Clare's assertions that we were slow to act. I mean, the Health Minister was bringing these issues before Cabinet as early as June or July last year as the vaccines were still being developed and negotiations were underway at that point. So I'm far more positive in my outlook. I recognise that there are some bumpy roads in relation to the virus. So as a Victorian, I haven't enjoyed the lockdowns and I haven't liked to see the impact it's had on people's mental health as well as their physical health, and the economic impacts have been obvious. So the vaccine rollout does need to continue. We need to give people the confidence that it is safe. And there's no question, David, this AstraZeneca announcement today was unexpected. But the advice still is that people who've had the first dose of AstraZeneca should proceed with the second. I intend to proceed with my second dose, and I'd encourage those in the same position as me to make sure they go ahead with it.
But surely you must agree it would have been better to get more Pfizer and Moderna locked in earlier.
Well, as I understand it, the negotiations started, and I just, at the risk of repeating myself, in about July last year with the providers of these vaccines. So you say do it earlier. The virus was still raging around the world at that point. And again, David, the point I made about the position we're in, I think it's 170 million people have been impacted by this virus. There's been 4 million deaths. Here in Australia, sadly, we've had 910 deaths. It's a tragedy for every one of those families involved. But we do need to recognise we are in a very strong position as a nation to continue the vaccine rollout and to build confidence in the community that it is safe.
Tom, let me just ask you about this AstraZeneca decision today. There's some criticism that it's overly cautious. When you look around the world, the UK is still making AstraZeneca available to everyone over 40. In South Korea, it's anyone over 30. In Germany, it's no age limit. Everyone can have AstraZeneca. But, as we've pointed out, this is the medical advice, the technical advisory group making this recommendation. Do you think they're being too cautious?
I think they are. The reality is this. Look, the blood clot rate on the latest figures is 2.7 per 100,000. So you go to the MCG when we're allowed to do that again. It's jam-packed. It's grand final day. Maybe the Bulldogs are playing. Maybe they're not. And you've got fewer than 3 people will be affected. Now, a year ago, when we were in the start of the really long lockdown in Victoria, we would have jumped at that risk-reward trade-off. And one of the reasons, by the way, that we have gone ahead with AstraZeneca, which is, I think, been a bit overlooked, CSL, which is the only big company in Australia which can manufacture vaccine, it could only make AstraZeneca. All right, we can't make Pfizer in Australia. We can't make Moderna. In a year, we might be able to, but even if we'd started that process a year ago, before we even knew what the different vaccines were going to do, AstraZeneca was the first one cleared that we could make in this country. And I've had it. I'll be having my second jab, and I would advise others to do the same thing. It's a good vaccine, and the risk of something going wrong is so low that if you worry about that, you would never step outside your front door every day.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I just think, just to add to that, I think it's not the AstraZeneca versus Pfizer. I think the comms have been appalling, really, from the federal government all the way through. And I think in the absence of clear, transparent communication which endorses and gets behind the science on this. I mean, this is a global pandemic crisis. I think what is missing in all of this is a clear plan and roadmap out in terms of how do we implement vaccinating. I mean, it was only today that New York opened up because they had a plan, they had a target. Their plan was to vaccinate 70% of the population to open up. And they did. With our government, the federal government, continues to flounder and flip-flop and talk about, they don't want to commit to targets because targets are unachievable. I think that is what's missing in this conversation. A clear roadmap, targeted response. How do we vaccinate the population? Because that is the only way to renew confidence both in society and in business so that we can open up.
well, I think
that's what's missing.
That brings us then to our next question, which comes from Arth Tatuje.
Good evening. My father, who's just next to me today, for 2 decades has owned and operated restaurants in Melbourne. He is one of hundreds of thousands of small business owners who make up the backbone of our economy. However, the most recent lockdown saw his restaurants close abruptly and with meagre support financially from both the state and federal government. It left him feeling isolated and as if his usually incredibly supportive political system left him isolated and in the dust. How can the state, and the Commonwealth for that matter, put in safeguards to ensure that there is a sufficient support system that can be accessed by relevant stakeholders in the event that another lockdown is implemented?
Susan, you run a business in Melbourne. What's your view on lockdowns and the supports that are available?
Well, I don't run a business as such. I'm a medical research foundation, so I support medical research, but I had been in private industry business for over 45 years in the building industry. And I noticed that particular industry hasn't stopped. It's just kept going the whole time throughout the pandemic. My heart aches for you. It really does. This should not have happened. Having 4 lockdowns, I ask the question all the time about what is the medical evidence. I want to know the real story. I want to know why we have to shut down. Epidemiologists, they all vary in their opinions, and I just don't know what's the correct answer. I delve all the time. I can't seem to find an answer to it. But in small business, they are being crucified. And I'm being very honest here. I feel so much for you. In my own building, in my own office complex, half the building now is vacated. My car park, it used to be a bun fight to get a car park. Now I could put up a marquee and have a party. That's how big, that's how free the car park is. These people have gone to the wall, never to return. I don't know what's going on. I don't have an answer to your problem. As I said, my heart aches for you. If I could have a solution and find a solution, I'd try and find it for you. It's up to the powers, the governments, to step up and do this and help our economy, help Victoria. Victoria is in a mess, in a huge mess. As far as I'm concerned, personally, I'm watching it firsthand. My family, my friends, I'm seeing them going to the wall. Not just their businesses, but mentally they're being affected terribly. They're losing heart. They just don't want to go on anymore. This is not the Australia that I grew up in. When I grew up as a child, I wanted to be an entrepreneur at 6. I wanted to be the best I could possibly be at whatever I took on in my life. Well, I don't think the kids today can aspire to that. So I wish you well in everything that you try and do. I hope the government step up and give you the support that you need. I hope all small businesses gather around you and we work together because after all, we all know this, small business is the backbone of this country and we must support you.
Thank you. Let me just come back to you and in fact, your father Ahmet, what would happen to your business in the event of another lockdown?
You'd probably have to shut shop.
You close the business?
We'll have to. We'll have to. There is, incidental costs in the city. There's a fair bit of money. My restaurant is in the CBD. Suburban restaurants, on the other hand, they have a lot more support from the locals because they can get to their 5-kilometre radius and pick up the takeaways and the deliveries. When city goes in a lockdown, it's a ghost town. Nobody comes out.
Yeah.
Today there's a rule that 25% people will come in. Tomorrow it'll be 50%, and then again day after it'll be 25%, or there'll be no people coming to the offices. People are now starting to get into the stage where they want to work from home.
Yeah.
So many offices in the city are vacant. I used to do this buffet lunch which was packed. I can't afford to do that anymore. Prices are not going down. I still have to pay the same price.
Yeah.
Wages cannot go down. People have to make their way. Full-time staff have to be paid. There's no more JobKeeper. Where do we go?
Well, Hana, let me ask you here, because you run the Moroccan Soup Bar in Melbourne. You've adjusted your business, particularly during the longer lockdown last year. Tell us what you've done, and is there advice to other businesses as to how they can pivot?
I guess, I mean, there hasn't been a single individual that hasn't been impacted by this pandemic. This is a pandemic. It's a global crisis, and it has impacted and transformed every facet of society. So I think it's not just business, and I think business has suffered absolutely. And I also think there are the sole traders, there are the retails, the gyms, all those people that don't get an ear into governments and into rebuilding. So for us, the crisis hit. We were a vibrant business where at the heart and foundation of our business was circuit breaking disadvantage for women so that the empowerment happened through employment. And when the crisis hit, like everybody in Melbourne and in Australia, we looked at our leaders. We looked at our leaders for a roadmap out. We looked at our leaders for instruction and direction. Nothing was forthcoming really early on. If you recall, there was a dissonance and a disconnect between the conversations that were happening overseas about the devastation unfolding, and we had Scott Morrison saying, let's go to the NRL. We had people talking about opening up and going to and having the Grand Prix. There were conversations that were disconnected with the reality of what was unfolding. And I think in a crisis, most of us looked at our leaders. We looked at our leaders to guide, to have a roadmap, to have some clarity so that we can build confidently. Now, for me, and certainly for our business, we then turned to the only people we could trust, which were the medical experts. They're the ones that enabled us to navigate and pivot around in a crisis that what was once an opportunity and support for women to keep them safe through employment became that women were kept safe at home. So we had to close our doors in the longest of lockdowns, the 4 months. So, and in that, I guess what we learned is there's a lot of noise. When leadership didn't step up, when our governments didn't offer confidence and clarity in a plan, that was filled by a lot of noise. A lot of noise that became very divisive. Anti-Dan, dictator Dan, lockdown Dan, we're locking Melbourne versus Sydney. That kind of conversation didn't help community, didn't instill confidence, didn't give us a plan. So for us, listening to the science and in that crisis, turning it around and looking at what we've learned. And yes, Susan, to your point, yes, we did come up with a vaccine in a year, but that's because people work together. Scientists work together,
men and
not
women
against each other. That is because across the globe, and we are better when we work together. So we've learned that, and we've learned that community cohesion, we have. Yes, it brought out the worst in human attributes, in people who pocketed the money, like Harvey Norman and whoever else. But it also meant that extraordinary community support came out and rallied behind causes and businesses and supported people that got nothing from governments.
Clearly there are businesses that are doing it very tough whenever there's a lockdown.
Absolutely.
And this question, we've got a question sent in from Stephen Jansen. It's a question we often hear. When's someone going to ask the state government in Victoria why can't they handle outbreaks like New South Wales? Why the need for a total shutdown? Look, the Victorian government has been asked that, but Tom, what's the answer?
Well, the answer is, I mean, we say, oh, there's the medical view and all that. There's different medical views. I know doctors who know Brett Sutton who think he's got it completely wrong. And it's clear that the Chief Health Officer...
Not a doctor.
He's not a doctor.
He's not a
researcher.
doctor.
All right, but what I'm saying is, as Chief Health Officer, they're just saying they disagree with him.
There are those who agree with him, though, who point out without these sort of short, sharp lockdowns, the virus would take off.
Well, all right, but the point is, up in Sydney, they have a different way of dealing with it. And so what we're seeing here, and remember, this is the reason we have states in Australia, it's called competitive federalism. We actually have different ways of doing things. We've had different laws, different ways of driving, different education systems, and we've had different ways of dealing with the virus. And it is clear to me that in Queensland and in New South Wales, they have handled it better. We have handled it terribly in this state. And I might just say, when it comes to small business, I think there is one person in the Victorian government, one, who has had experience in small business. All right? So if you are a small business person and you are looking to a government for leadership, you don't have anybody in the government who's done that sort of thing. So that's why you won't get that leadership.
Well,
Martin Pakula said the other day, he said, the revenue will come back in a few weeks, as though businesses can just shut their doors for 3 or 4 weeks and not make any money, and then it will be fine once they reopen. The customers will just be queued up around the block. It's not like that. And only someone who's never worked in business would say something like that.
I should point out there were some very good unemployment figures today. It fell to 5.1%. In Victoria, it's one of the lowest in the country.
It is.
At 4.8%. But Clare O'Neil, back to this question around, New South Wales has got a small number of cases now. They're not locking down. I know this question gets asked a lot, but what is the answer? Why is it dealt with differently here in Victoria?
I mean, we have a small number of cases still most days here in Victoria, and we're coming out of lockdown, not going into it. So I don't think it's quite fair to draw this sort of black and white observation about the way different states are managing this. I think the much more important point actually is about this issue about small business, because people are suffering as we go in and out of lockdown, and I just really feel for you, sir. I grew up in a small business household. Both my parents ran small businesses, and I know a little bit, therefore, about just the blood, sweat and tears that goes into this to create something that didn't exist before, and to have it knocked over through no fault of your own is just devastating. So I really do, my heart just goes out to you. Just in terms of support, one of the things that I don't think we've done very well is target support at people that need it and not at those that don't. And Hana, you mentioned before, the federal government blasted literally hundreds of millions of dollars into firms that got JobKeeper that saw their profits boom during the lockdown. Why don't we go and get some of that money back and give it to people like you who are genuinely suffering?
Yes, but this 7-day lockdown is now 3 weeks.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have been a 7-day lockdown. Have we opened up? No, we haven't.
Yeah.
It's 3 weeks.
Yeah. And
how much longer can people go on and put up with this?
Happy to absorb the heat, but it's not my decision that's led to this, and I totally understand why everyone's so frustrated. I'm frustrated. I think the state government's very frustrated too. Can I tell you, sir, the best thing that we can do for small business in this country is find a pathway out of this thing, which is a vaccination program that works, and purpose-built quarantine facilities that don't leak every few days in different states around the country. I mean, we've got people... We've got so many people who are coming into the country who have lived overseas in COVID-ridden countries, done everything they can to protect themselves, and come to Australia and caught COVID in quarantine. Like, this is ridiculous. Okay. Hotels are for tourists, not to fight a viral illness of this kind. So I just think we've got to get the government on the right page here. 124th in the world on vaccinations, a quarantine system that doesn't work properly, and we're not going to get to where we want to go until those two problems are fixed.
I feel like I need to point out that none of us here are infectious diseases experts. They may have different views on the merits of lockdowns and so on, but there's a clear view about the need for business support coming through. Darren Chester, let's come to you on this. If it was good enough last year, as Clare O'Neil says, spend hundreds of millions of dollars on billions of dollars on JobKeeper. We're still in the pandemic. Why not now?
Well, David, there was a lot in the conversation. I didn't want to interrupt from a long way away, but you've got to remember that at the height of the pandemic last year, and I reject Hana's point that there was no plan, at the height of the pandemic last year, the government introduced JobKeeper, which supported 3.8 million people and kept them connected to their jobs. The federal government has provided more support than the states combined. So it's not as if the federal government hasn't been providing support either through JobKeeper or through stimulus to local government for infrastructure and a range of other initiatives. Now, in terms of the question about lockdown though, David, I can't understand as a Victorian why we've had 140 days of lockdown and the average across other states is 6. So obviously we've got a different risk profile in Victoria, or we're not prepared to accept any risk amongst the health authorities in Victoria compared to other states. Now, New South Wales, when it's had a few cases, has acted to lock down small parts of those areas and encourage people to make the right decisions, get tested, to do all the right things that we expect in terms of social distancing and wearing masks where required. But Victoria goes straight to lockdowns, not only lockdowns in the metropolitan area, and I'm so sorry to hear about your business, Ahmed, and I hope there's a way for you to get through it in the coming weeks and months. But not only have we locked down metropolitan areas, we've locked down regional communities which haven't seen a single case of the coronavirus. We've locked down communities which are 500 and 600 kilometres away from Melbourne. Little places like Mallacoota and Mildura have had to endure lockdowns because there's cases in Melbourne. Now, I think the Victorian government has to revisit its whole attitude to risk and to understand that there is going to be cases on an occasional basis that we have to deal with it, and we have to work with the community on that. But the economic costs and the mental health costs of continuing to lock down the community. I mean, why did Victoria have more than 20 weeks of learning from home in our schools?
No more lockdowns, you're saying? There should be no more lockdowns?
Well, they've got to be a last resort, David. They have to be a last resort. They can't be... Well, they have been the first choice of Victoria on too many occasions.
That's not true. We had the Black Rock, we had a couple of other outbreaks that were managed without lockdown, and I think they are the last resort, and they are about keeping people safe according to the health advice. I think the rest of it is a lot of noise, really.
All right, we do need to move on. Let's go to our next question, which tonight comes from Emily Dobson.
The decision by Mr Hawke to exercise ministerial power and allow the Murugappan family to live in community detention temporarily while 4-year-old Thanika receives medical treatment is one that has reinforced there's no pathway to a visa, but it's been cited that there is showing appropriate compassion. Why is appropriate compassion only shown in life or death circumstances?
Darren Chester?
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for the question. And I guess compared to the rest of the panellists tonight, I'm in the most difficult position as a member of the executive, a member of cabinet, and I don't want to say anything that's going to particularly jeopardise the family's situation in terms of further avenues for appeal they may have open to them and further court proceedings I understand could be underway. There is no shortage of empathy or compassion amongst the Australian people or amongst the Parliament on both sides of the House in terms of the situation the family has found themselves in. But the point I guess I want to make, without going down to specific details of this case, David, is that our nation does play a very big role in terms of providing visas for people who are deemed to be refugees or in need of protection. In fact, over the past decade, we've provided 168,000 protection visas. So it's not as if Australia doesn't provide visas for people who need that protection and when they need it. Now, I don't want to get into the details of the case because I understand there are some more proceedings. But
I think we're still able to talk about the case. And the question really goes to why is compassion only shown now when it becomes a big public and political issue? Was it compassionate to keep this family with 2 young girls on Christmas Island for nearly 2 years?
Well, at this point, David, the point I was trying to get to, at this point, going through all the legal channels available to them in Australia, the family had not been identified or recognised as refugees or warranting the protection visa that they sought. So they weren't identified, and there have been other families...
Does that mean they have to go to Christmas Island?
Well, other families and people, individuals who came as unauthorised arrivals to our country in the past who have been returned to Sri Lanka, and that has been a process that has been underway now for many years. Now, it is an area of public policy that is not without an enormous amount of complexities. I know, David, you're aware. You were a press gallery journalist, as I was a backbencher in opposition during the time where we had 50,000 people arrive on boats on Australian shores, and tragically, at that time, 1,200 people died trying to make the journey. And
so that's why this family has to spend 2 years nearly on Christmas Island, is it?
No, David, I'm not. It's not about punishing people or anything like that. What I'm trying to say is the settings you put in place at a federal level around border security to regain control of your borders then allows the government to do its share of the heavy lifting around resettling refugees and people around the world who find themselves in dire circumstances. And Australians are a fair nation, we're a compassionate nation, we do our share in terms of resettling people who are in need of that protection, but we have to have an orderly system, or the whole chaotic scenes we saw, about 10 years ago now, 8 years ago, will return. And there is nothing compassionate, David, I want to really stress this point, there is nothing compassionate about a system that allows people to die at sea, that allows people smugglers to take control. And as a Veterans Minister, I have met with family members who have lost a loved one, who worked on border protection, who were traumatised by having to retrieve bodies from the sea. And now these are really difficult issues. I don't pretend otherwise, and I understand that there are strong emotions about it. As a local member, I've had dozens of calls to my office, as I'm sure Clare has. If the minister involved can work through the process and the legal structures he has available to him and get a positive result, I think Australians would be...
What's a positive result? I want to move on, but what's a positive result? You mean they should be allowed to stay?
Well, David, the problem I have in making any comment is there has to be, if there is a result for the family that can be a legal avenue, that they fulfil the obligations put in our legislation, and then that can be repeated for other families in similar situations, then that's the process we have in place. And, it is a very sad and difficult issue.
Clare O'Neil, Labor's said they should be allowed to return to Billawheeler. Are you saying they should be given a permanent stay in Australia, or only temporary refugee visas?
I mean, they've got a number of legal channels that they're continuing to pursue at the moment to try to get a permanent visa to stay in Australia. I think the inarguable point at the moment is that they should be back in their home in Billow, where there's a community that wants them there. They've got, supports, they've got roots that have been set down here. But in terms of the permanency of it, the thing is, the Immigration Minister has entire discretion. And he has discretion because when people don't meet the exact technical definition of what's in the law, we still sometimes need people to stay in the country. And I think the way that this family's been treated is just terrible. And, Darren said dozens of calls. I mean, this is one of the biggest issues that's come across my desk as a Member of Parliament this year.
Yeah,
the thing that makes this case different and worthy, I think, of the use of the discretion is the fact that at the heart of this are two children who have done nothing wrong. And that little girl who's in hospital at the moment, she has spent more than half of her life in detention. How can that possibly be justified? I don't think Australians want that. I think there's a clear desire in the community to have strong borders. That's something that Labor believes in. But that doesn't mean that we treat people this way. It just seems so odd to me.
But coming back to what should happen, just to be clear on this, there are about 18,000 who have been found to be refugees, but they're only on temporary protection visas. Are you saying this family should be given a permanent stay?
Well, with the people who are here on temporary protection visas, Labor has a long-standing policy of abolishing temporary protection visas.
So you'll get rid of those temporary visas?
It's in Labor's platform, and I think you'll hear some more detail about that as we come into the election. But what these visas do, David, as you probably know, is they make people prove that they're refugees, but don't give them any opportunity to actually do what's in their interests and our interests as Australians, which is set down roots and invest in developing a life here. Instead, they have to reapply for their visa after 3 or 5 years, and it's set up this incredibly expensive, bureaucratic and complicated process for people who have proven to be refugees. If they're proven to be refugees and they're here in Australia, then we don't think that a temporary approach is the right one.
Just quickly, Hana, what do you think should happen here?
Look, I think this family is a product of a very cruel policy. A policy, again, when we look at every facet of society, there's no leadership on this issue. And whether we have bipartisan agreement or we start the jargon around starting up boats and not wanting the cruelty of people dying at sea, we have had a policy in place around people seeking asylum, which at its heart presumes that these people are illegal. It is not illegal to seek asylum. Everybody has absolutely. So on a legal front, people have a right to seek asylum. Secondly, in terms of economically, it doesn't make sense. It costs us $10,000 per detainee per day to keep them in the cruelest of conditions. And thirdly, when it comes to our humanity, read the room. The majority of Australians have shifted their perspective and view and aren't party to some of the jargon and some of the fear-mongering that's going on. People want them to stay. Billawilla, I'd never heard of Billawilla until I heard of this family. So I think rural communities and communities that are getting behind and the Australian sentiment, and these cruelties are happening on our watch. And lastly, in terms of future and where we go with immigration policy, we need to think about what happens when there are going to be environmental refugees coming onto our shores. How will we deal with them? How will we deal with people genuinely seeking asylum? This cruelty's got to stop, and I think there needs to be some leadership from governments and for that leadership to be bipartisan. Enough already.
Susan.
What I'm going to say is I don't think I'll be very popular, but Australia is a country of a fair go, and yes, we should be showing compassion and all the care that we can give to this family. My husband came to this country as a migrant many, many years ago and went through the appropriate channels to come here. We have protocols in place that need to be followed. What about all the thousands and thousands of migrants who have come to this country and gone through the proper processes? What will they be thinking? What will they be saying about this? I know how hard it is for a migrant to come to this country with no language, no money, no family. This is what these people have done. And they've been a lot of them have been very, very successful. Yes, my heart aches for these people that we should be showing them compassion, this family right now. And I know Australia will do that, and our government acknowledges that. But what about all the migrants that have come to this country and that have followed the appropriate protocols just to get to this great country, Australia, and enjoy the benefits that we have to offer to all Australian citizens? I know I won't be popular in saying this, but they're my thoughts on the matter.
Tom, there has been clearly a lot of public sympathy and support for this family in particular. What do you think should happen?
Look, I just think we apply the rules. The rules have been hammered out. We've had this debate so many times. We had, years ago, Labor had a different position on people coming in boats, as it was mainly then, and that was very much on our TV screens. And the coalition said, no, we're going to change this. And then Labor said, yes, we'll agree, we should change it. And now we're having another debate. And this whole thing about reading the room and whatever, it's like being at the Colosseum in ancient Rome, thumb up or thumb down. We don't want a system based on that. These children look lovely, and I'm sure they are, but is that how we are going to judge migrants, to have everybody being paraded in front of us and we decide which ones we like and which ones we don't? We have rules for a good reason. We've hammered them out over years and years and years of seeing what happens when we have different rules and what works and what does not. Just apply the rules. It's like the law. It should apply equally to everybody. If these people are genuinely refugees, they stay. If they are not, they go back to Sri Lanka. It's that simple. It doesn't need endless debate because we've had it before.
All right, let's move on to our next questions, coming from Jaden Anthony.
I was one of the many thousands affected by power outages in Melbourne's outer east after storms last week. While waiting for the power to be reconnected, I couldn't help but consider the benefits of battery storage and how much it would have helped people in these situations. Why isn't battery storage technology being used to secure the energy network all over the country?
This, it raises a few questions here about what's going on in Victoria with the power outages, but Claire, just quickly on the idea of battery storage, is that the answer to these sort of situations?
I mean, I'd probably need to think about it a little bit more. I feel like we've just had, virtually a natural disaster in Victoria, and probably designing an energy solution around something that doesn't happen very frequently isn't the ideal. But I think there are plenty of other reasons why we might want to look at that, and that is that, we've got Australians voting with their feet on the shift to renewables, and solar panels are on, I think, a quarter of all Australian households, or something extraordinary now. Once we get battery technology up to scratch that can help power homes, and it's still quite expensive for families to do that, then I think we get a great outcome for the climate and, more secure energy sources for people's homes. So sounds like a good idea to me, but I think the technology isn't quite there yet to make this affordable for most people.
For what it's worth, I actually invested in battery storage a couple of years ago, and I watch it. Actually, it's very interesting. You can get these apps and see on certain sorts of days, like it's not the hottest days where you get the most power, it's the day that's 25 degrees with no cloud cover. What is interesting, I got the biggest battery I could get, and the technology is now 3 to 4 years old. And without really changing what we do at home, we probably have knocked off half of our power bill. So the solar panels and the battery gives us half what a normal house would use, we still need mains power to live a normal life.
Darren Chester, let me just come to Darren Chester here, because in case you missed it with the T-shirt there, you do represent a part of Victoria that's been hit hard by these storms, and some Victorians are being told they may not have power for another 3 weeks. Yeah. What's going on there?
Yeah, look, David, the storm was extraordinary in its ferocity. The scale of the winds and the trees it's brought down across large parts of regional Victoria and the Dandenong ranges is something I've never seen before. So huge trees down, and my heart really goes out to the families who, 24 hours without powers, a bit of fun, a bit of camping perhaps, but 5 and 6 days is a nightmare if you've got kids. And then you're going to talk about weeks and weeks potentially for some of the more remote areas. And I've got dairy farmers in my electorate too who've had trouble even milking their cows, and that's been a real issue for us. So, that has been the story of the storm. It's been horrific for us, and there's been some flooding too in parts of my electorate around Traralgon. But those things we're working on together very strong as a community in terms of clean-up. So you've got to thank the SES volunteers, the CFA, all the different volunteer groups to get out, the police and the AMBOs. They do a great job. I'd like to see the military brought in, the Australian Defence Force brought in now to help us with the clean-up. I mean, they're not first responders. They're not there to be there during the actual crisis, but they're certainly very good at that general duties work around helping to clear roads with heavy machinery,
So why isn't that happening?
type of thing.
Why isn't that happening?
Well, the problem there is it's up to the Victorian government to make an application for that, and it hasn't happened yet. The Australian Defence Force can't impose themselves upon a state. It's up to the state which runs the response and the relief and the recovery operations. And I'm hoping the Victorian government will put some requests in for some workers on the ground, because I know what they were able to do in Gippsland, in East Gippsland during the Black Summer bushfires, the morale boost we got from having the men and women of the Australian Defence Force turn up, help farmers out, help communities out, just be around the community and just help us get on top of that recovery. So that's a real challenge for us now. And again, it's a small part of my electorate, so perhaps 1/3 of my electorate's been impacted. So I encourage anyone who's thinking about a long weekend now to come down to Gippsland. The other parts haven't been impacted, so come on down.
I'm glad you got the plug in there. Glad you got the plug in there. No, fair enough. Okay.
No, but the challenge that your question raised in regards of energy security is a valid one. We've never seen so much impact to so many lines at the same time, and so the crews are out there working, trying to restore power, have a very difficult task, and it's pretty tough work in hospital conditions, and there's the scale of the damage is very significant, David.
All right. Our next question comes from Tom Ingleton.
Thanks, David. My question is for the panel. As a nation, we claim to have made so many inroads with providing equality for both men and women in sport. However, Olympic athlete Maddie Groves is yet another woman unable to receive adequate support by a sporting body, and has put her career in jeopardy in order to try and earn justice. Why haven't Swimming Australia established sufficient processes to truly aid Maddie against misogyny and allow women to feel safe in their work environment?
Susan Alberti, you're a trailblazer when it comes to women's AFL in particular. Can you understand why Swimming Australia didn't have better processes in place, or do you think they have handled this appropriately?
When I first read about that happening, I thought to myself immediately that was disgusting, unacceptable, and there should have been an inquiry, or they should have looked into that matter immediately. But I really haven't heard much about what's gone on, what the inquiry's been all about. But look, it's like everything in sport, with women in sport. I constantly say this, and I think I'm boring actually when I say women don't want to be superior to men. They just want to be treated as equal. And you're highlighting something that is happening right across women in sport. They're not being given a fair go at being the best that they possibly can in so many ways. We talk about AFL, yes, I've been involved with AFL longer than I want to remember, but I support all women in all sport, and these women need to be supported. And this is totally unacceptable, what's happened to this swimmer. Why should she have to give up her position on the Olympic team? And that's why it's important we encourage our children to participate in sport, because we won't have kids who want to go to the Olympics. We won't have any Olympians if this is what's happening to them at this senior level? Why do I want to aspire to be an Olympian when this is going to happen to me? This has got to change, and it's got to change now, right across women in sport. Again, we just want to be treated as equals. That's all I'm asking for.
Claire, can I ask you about this? Because there's been a lot of focus this year, obviously, about what's been going on in Parliament House, and sometimes official complaints are made. Sometimes women worry about their career prospects if they make an official complaint. Here we're talking about leading sporting organisations.
Yeah.
Are there parallels? How should the system work?
Huge parallels, and I think it's a great question, Tom. I'm really glad you asked it. I think we've just had a really good example in Canberra of how not to handle such a situation, and so Swimming Australia needs to learn from that. Don't blame the victim. Don't push the responsibility for change onto the people who are the victims of the problem. Don't pretend that they're a few bad apples when it's clearly cultural issues within the organisation. And for God's sake, the leaders need to take responsibility of the culture that's flourished, because they're the only ones that can actually fix it. So we saw all these things go totally wrong with the Brittany Higgins incident that occurred in Canberra, and unfortunately continue to this day. I would say with Swimming Australia, this is an organisation that's close to the heart of every Australian. We are so proud of our swimmers in this country. They can show us how to do this properly, and I really want to urge them to do that. I think the initial sounds out of Swimming Australia, to be frank, haven't been too positive. They seem to be pushing Maddie Groves to say, well, you've got to provide us with details of these allegations.
They have now set up an independent commission to look into this.
Yeah, which is good. But I think it's noteworthy that that's the default setting, isn't it? When women come out and complain and try to raise these things, the default setting is, we don't really believe you. Now it's your job to convince us that this
Claire,
is a
it must be
problem.
done now, not pushed aside all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, wait for another day. Well, I've had enough of that.
Yeah.
Talk is cheap. Let's make it happen now.
Yep, I totally agree with you, Susan. I just think that there's an iconic organisation at the heart of this. They can set an example for the rest of the country, and I hope they do
Absolutely,
it.
Claire, I agree with you.
Let's take our final question tonight from Sajda Yaqub.
Hi, my question is in relation to the Christchurch terrorist attack and the movie that's being made on it. Growing up as a practicing Muslim in Australia, I've got a lot of stories to tell. And I'd like to ask you, why do you think rich, white Hollywood producers and writers chose to ignore our stories and instead tell the story of a white woman with absolutely no lived experience of Islamophobia?
Hana.
Come to me with
that.
I guess because it's popular, because it sells movies, because that is the popular narrative that has been since September 11. I think that Muslims need to be rescued and need to fall into the fold of being empowered in Western democracies. And that story in the form of film speaks to that. So we need to be saved, and we need to be saved by systems and lifestyles and cultures which take us out of and rescue us from our lived realities. And I think as a woman who's lived through, and for the past 2 decades, through that environment, and who's acutely felt the impact of that discourse, I think what the Christchurch, and in particular this conversation around the film, what they're saying is respect that we're not ready. So I think there's a couple of issues here. One is, why do we need a narrative that represents the white saviour versus Muslims? But the other issue, the flip side of this particular conversation, is that we divide the conversation because we feel that Muslims don't have a right to legitimately voice what it is freely that they need. And what they're clearly saying is respect that we are not ready. That conversation turns into cancel culture and, oh my God, and these people are trying to censor. Nobody's censoring anything. And we are better when we can come together and learn to listen to what people are saying.
Well, Tom, what do you think? Should this film be made?
Well, one is, we don't know exactly what's in the film yet. I mean, it's just an idea.
That's true.
Secondly, the white woman in question is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. So, she was a pretty important player in what happened that day. I remember I was on radio that day as it was happening, and we were, trying to work out what had happened. In fact, I had an interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger that day, and I had to say, no, we're not doing that, which, the thing was, we don't know what's in the film. it's always awkward for audiences who are affected by something to say it. I mean, I remember when Saving Private Ryan came out, they dug up some veterans of Omaha Beach at Normandy who were in tears after watching the first half hour of the movie, which is very graphic. Now, should it have been made? Shouldn't it? I mean, it was 50 years later and it still really affected the veterans who had been there that day. I suppose what I would say here is that, I mean, this is in New Zealand, remember, also. If Muslims want to tell a story from their own perspective or a different way, why not make a film about that? Because you'll never stop what Hollywood wants to do. And there have often been multiple movies made about the same event. So I would say that, you know, it is in the grasp of Islamic filmmakers, if they want to tell the story from a different perspective, why not just do that?
Hannah, just come back to you on that. What's wrong with that approach? Have two films made?
Look, you can have, and you will have, a myriad of films made, but I think listening to a community who is saying clearly they are not ready, that this incident, so I don't think it's not that we don't know the content of the film. I think there were 60,000 signatures of people that were directly impacted by the Christchurch shootings who are clearly saying we are not ready, this is too raw. And on top of that, what they're saying is, and I'm a fan of Jacinda Ardern, I think her compassion is extraordinary, but I don't think that is the story that needs to be told at this point if we listen to the people that have been impacted by it. That's all that's been asked here. Nobody's saying don't make a film, do make a film. But I think what they're suggesting is if everybody has the capacity to express their views, then at least respect and listen to what we're saying.
I mean, it's interesting with Port Arthur, there's two films being made.
100% right.
Sorry, Darren, just quickly.
Sorry to butt in, David. Hannah's 100% right. We've got to respect the community, and if they're saying they're not ready, then they're not ready. And even if we think they're ready, we're not the ones who have been harmed in this whole terrible tragedy. So I find with our veterans community so many times, I'm not a veteran, I need to listen to them and understand and try and walk a mile in their shoes and understand their perspective. And I think Tom was about to mention the plan for a film on the Port Arthur massacre. Now, 25 years after the event, that is still very raw in Tasmania, and Tasmanians are very nervous about that film being made as well. So I think respecting the fact that this has been an enormous tragedy, and I think your questioner this evening has touched a raw nerve as well. This is something that the community may not be ready for.
Yeah, let me, in fact, give the final word on this to our questioner, Sajid. Do you largely agree with, well, either of you, do you agree with the position that Hana and the Minister have stated?
Do you agree with the Minister's position?
Oh, what was the Minister?
The position being that we need to respect the views of the community. It is too soon to go ahead with this sort of film.
Definitely. I think there's a right way to tell the story and there's a wrong way to tell the story. And they've chosen the wrong way. They've chosen, when they say they consult members of the Muslim community, I mean, how many members are we talking? You know, how many Muslims have we got in New Zealand and how many were impacted directly and indirectly? How many did they consult? You know, it's not, it becomes a bit tokenistic in that sense as to did you consult 1 or 2 or maybe 10 and think, oh, yep, that's fine, it's a consensus all throughout. Clearly it isn't. And I mean, the Muslim community has spoken out against that. And I think if they don't respect that, it's going to show that the intentions perhaps aren't in the correct place.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question and the contribution. Now, look, before we go, a clarification on an earlier claim. I don't know who made it in particular. It was a claim about Brett Sutton, Chief Health Officer in Victoria. He is a medical doctor who's worked in both emergency medicine and public health. So we just want to get that on the record tonight before we go. That is all we have time for. Would you please thank our panel, Hana Assafiri, Susan Alberti, Tom Elliott, Clare O'Neil and Darren Chester. And thank you all for your questions tonight, some terrific questions. Next week, Hamish will be back live from Sydney and Jayden Evans from Love on the Spectrum joins the panel to discuss all the issues of the week, including the proposed shake-up of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Who will be better off? Who loses out? Until then, good night.
He's not an epidemiologist.